In the year 1700, India made up almost a quarter of the world's economy. It was the beating heart of global trade, a land of gold, silk, and spices, exporting fine cottons and jewels across continents. Its cities glowed with craftsmanship and commerce. Bengal alone was richer than the whole of Britain. But by 1947, when India finally gained independence, its share of the world economy had fallen to less than 4%. The difference didn't vanish. It was taken. Not through invasion alone but through ledgers, taxes, and trade law. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. For 2 centuries, the British Empire engineered one of the most efficient systems of extraction in human history. They didn't just rule India. They monetized it. They transformed a civilization that had once exported luxury goods to Rome, Arabia, and China into a supplier of cheap raw materials for British industry. And they did it through a quiet revolution in accounting. This is not a story about nationalism or revenge. It's about math. About how one of the richest societies on earth became one of the poorest, not by war, but by financial design. To understand it, we have to start at the beginning, long before the Union Jack flew over Delhi. In the early 1600s, the Mughal Empire governed India. It was a sprawling, sophisticated civilization of nearly 150 million people, almost a quarter of the world's population. The Mughals presided over booming agriculture, advanced irrigation, and bustling ports. Indian textiles were so prized that European merchants sailed for months just to bring back bolts of cotton. Pepper, indigo, silk, all of it flowed out through the ports of Surat and Calcutta. India ran a trade surplus with almost everyone. Gold and silver flowed into the subcontinent, not out. But across the sea, a small island nation was rising, ambitious, armed, and organized around something new: the Joint Stock Company. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group of London merchants, the East India Company. It wasn't a government, but it would become one. It had shareholders, a board of directors, and soon an army. At first, the company was just another trader in a crowded marketplace. Portugal, the Netherlands, and France already had a presence in India. But where others sought partnership, the British sought monopoly. Their secret weapon wasn't diplomacy or guns, it was finance. They had ships financed through bonds, insurance underwritten by Lloyd's, and a London credit network that allowed them to scale trade like no empire before. The company quickly realized that the real profit wasn't in trade, it was in taxation. In 1757, everything changed. The Battle of Plassey, a small clash in Bengal, became the pivot of world history. With fewer than 1,000 British soldiers and a handful of local allies, the East India Company defeated the Nawab of Bengal. But the real victory came afterward. The company installed a puppet ruler, granting itself the right to collect Bengal's taxes. That decision marked the birth of corporate colonialism. Within a decade, the company was siphoning tens of millions of pounds out of Bengal every year, a transfer of wealth so large that it triggered inflation, famine, and financial collapse across the region. London boomed, Calcutta starved. To the British Parliament, the profits were staggering. The East India Company's dividends soared. Share prices in London exploded. Investors who had never set foot in Asia were getting rich off Indian taxes. And yet, those same taxes were collected from farmers who couldn't afford to eat. The company had become something the world had never seen before, a private empire with its own currency, army, and judiciary. Its executives in London sat in polished boardrooms, while its agents in India oversaw forced labor, monopolized trade, and crushed local industries under the pretense of free markets. This wasn't just looting. It was systematic transfer. When famine hit Bengal in 1770, one of the worst in recorded history, it killed around 10 million people. But even as bodies lined the roads, company revenues increased. They kept collecting taxes. They kept exporting grain. For London investors, it was a good year. The idea of a market had replaced the idea of mercy. Meanwhile, British economists back home justified it all as civilization. They argued that India was backward, that Britain was modernizing it, building railways, introducing law, spreading English education. But every one of those improvements was engineered for extraction. Railways weren't built to connect Indians to each other, they were built to connect cotton fields to ports. Schools didn't educate a new middle class, they trained clerks for colonial offices. And the courts didn't protect rights, they enforced debt. Even the railways, often romanticized as the empire's gift, were financed in a way that guaranteed British profit. British investors were promised a 5% return backed by Indian taxpayers no matter how the railways performed. The profits flowed to London, the costs stayed in Calcutta. This was the financial equivalent of a vampire system, one that drained without bleeding. The mechanism became so efficient that it got its own name, the drain of wealth. Indian intellectual Dadabhai Naoroji, in his 1901 book Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, described it as the bleeding of India, a steady flow of resources, labor, and capital to Britain, without any reciprocal benefit. He estimated that, by the late 19th century, India was losing hundreds of millions of pounds annually, wealth that funded Britain's industrial revolution and imperial wars. And he was right. Between 1765 and 1938, historians estimate that Britain extracted the modern equivalent of $45 trillion from India. That's more than the GDP of the United States and China combined today. The math is staggering. But the real impact wasn't just economic, it was human. For centuries, India had exported high-value goods and imported precious metals. Under British rule, that flipped. India began exporting raw cotton, opium, and grain and importing finished British goods. The country's artisans, weavers, and merchants, once the backbone of a global luxury economy, were wiped out by policy. British textiles flooded the Indian market at prices no local craftsman could match. Entire towns known for weaving and fabric production like Dhaka fell into ruin. By the mid-1800s, India had gone from world's largest textile producer to a mere supplier of raw cotton for Manchester's factories. This was globalization 19th century style. India became the raw material for Britain's industrial rise and its captive customer. Even as British officials boasted of modernization, India's per capita income stagnated for nearly 2 centuries. Famines became more frequent, wages collapsed, and yet the empire grew richer. It wasn't an accident. It was a business model. Every empire in history had taken tribute. But the British found a way to make tribute look like trade. By the 19th century, the East India Company had been replaced by direct crown rule after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, but the financial machinery remained untouched. The Raj didn't need conquest anymore. It had something more powerful: contracts. Indian revenues paid for British wars in Afghanistan, pensions for British civil servants, even the salaries of colonial officers in Africa. The cost of empire was outsourced to the colonized. And for Britain, it was the deal of the millennium. India financed its conqueror. By the late 19th century, the system had evolved into something even more refined, a model of financial imperialism so sophisticated that it didn't even look like exploitation. It looked like management. The British Raj had perfected a structure of home charges, payments India had to make to Britain each year for services rendered. These included the salaries of British officials in India, interest on loans raised in London for railways and infrastructure, pensions for retired civil servants, and even the cost of the British Army stationed there. In theory, these were administrative expenses. In practice, they were an elegant accounting trick to siphon wealth. Every year, enormous sums left India without any corresponding inflow. No goods were exchanged, no services received. It was pure financial outflow, a colonial balance sheet that sent value north and left poverty behind. By the early 20th century, these transfers exceeded £100 million annually, equivalent to tens of billions of dollars today. Cumulatively, economists estimate that over 2 centuries, the empire extracted the modern equivalent of $45 trillion. It's a number so large it barely feels real, but you can see its consequences everywhere. India's once thriving economy of artisans and merchants was replaced by a peasantry trapped in debt. Britain's industrial cities Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool were built on the profits of Indian raw materials. The textile mills of Lancashire glowed through the night because India's looms went silent. To the British Parliament, this was progress. To India, it was deindustrialization. Textiles weren't the only casualty. India's shipbuilding, ironworks, and carpentry trades all declined under British policy. Indian forests were stripped to supply railway sleepers. Indian farmers were pushed into cash crops like indigo and opium, which served Britain's external trade, not India's food security. And when drought struck, the results were catastrophic. Between 1876 and 1902, a series of famines swept the subcontinent, killing over 20 million people. During those same years, India exported millions of tons of grain to Britain. Grain that could have fed the dying was shipped abroad because export revenue mattered more than human life. A British official named Sir Richard Temple even argued against famine relief, claiming it would spoil the market. Markets had become the measure of morality. But perhaps the most brilliant and sinister part of the system was how it used India's own money to sustain the empire. When the British fought wars in Afghanistan, Burma, or Africa, the bills were often paid from Indian revenues. India wasn't just a colony, it was the empire's central bank. Indian soldiers fought on every front from Sudan to Singapore, their wages deducted from Indian taxpayers. British infrastructure worldwide was financed by Indian capital. The empire ran on Indian rupees, even as Indian villages starved for lack of coins, and while Indian peasants lived on subsistence, British investors enjoyed guaranteed returns on Indian infrastructure. The railways so often cited as Britain's gift to India were built with British capital under contracts that guaranteed a 5% annual return, underwritten by Indian taxes. If the railways didn't earn enough profit, Indian taxpayers made up the difference. The risk was Indian. The reward was British. This was colonial finance, privatized profit, socialized cost. Even after the East India Company was dissolved, its logic survived. London financiers realized they didn't need to conquer countries to profit from them. They only needed to control credit. Empire had discovered its final form, debt. After independence in 1947, India inherited not just poverty, but a system of dependency. Centuries of extraction had hollowed out local industries, destroyed capital reserves, and left the country with less than 2% literacy and chronic famine. But the world India entered wasn't free. It was financially globalized, built on the same principles the empire had pioneered: trade imbalance, capital flow, and invisible extraction. Developing nations, newly independent but economically fragile, were soon caught in a familiar trap. They exported raw materials, imported finished goods, and borrowed money in foreign currencies to pay for it. Sound familiar? It's the same structure that drained India for 2 centuries, updated for the 20th century. Today, the mechanism has changed names. It's called debt dependency or structural adjustment. The IMF and World Bank don't wield muskets or armies, but they use conditional loans, austerity programs, and trade rules that often produce the same result: wealth flowing from the poor to the rich, disguised as policy. Every year, developing nations collectively send over $200 billion more in interest and profit repatriation to wealthy economies than they receive in aid. The direction of the drain hasn't reversed, it's just become digital. The empire may have collapsed, but the spreadsheets are still running. This is the quiet truth of global capitalism. It was built on the blueprint of empire. The same logic of extraction, only cleaner, quieter, and harder to see. When Britain industrialized, it did so with Indian resources, Indian labor, and Indian revenue. When modern nations industrialize today, they often do it with outsourced labor, foreign debt, and offshore profits. Different era, same imbalance. The lesson is stark and deeply modern. Empires don't end. They evolve. They move from land to ledger, from gunpowder to contracts, from conquest to compliance. And India's story is the clearest proof of that evolution. Because what Britain built in India wasn't just colonial rule. It was the prototype of the modern global economy, one where value flows upward, invisibly, through systems of credit, trade, and taxation. The Raj was the world's first free market.
It's too hard.
Experiment, but only one side was free. Even today, when we talk about globalization, we often forget how it began as a network of extraction routes. The ships that once carried silk and spices now carry capital. The banks that once financed empire now finance development. And the profits still move in the same direction. But India endured. And that may be the story's final twist. Despite 2 centuries of looting, famine, and division, India rebuilt. It nationalized its industries, reformed its currency, and began reclaiming what had been taken not through revenge, but through reinvention. Today, India is one of the world's fastest-growing economies.
Agreed. Review the
But the
conditions.
scars of the past remain, even now. The wealth gap between the global north and south reflects those same historical lines. Old trade routes fossilized into capital flows. Which raises a question that every generation has to face: when a system rewards extraction more than creation, can it ever be truly free? Because in the end, what the British Empire proved is not that empires fall but that they adapt. And what India proved is that even the most exploited nations can rise again. But recovery takes time, extraction is instant. That's the cruel arithmetic of empire. The British didn't just conquer India with armies. They conquered it with accountants. And the ledger they opened in 1757 is still being balanced today, just with different names and newer tools. History doesn't repeat, but the balance sheet still rhymed. That if this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, I'll show you where to look.